Hi, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Arvind Venugopal, and I'm with Media Partners Asia. We are a media research and advisory firm based out of Hong Kong, Singapore, and Mumbai in India. First of all, before I begin the presentation, I'd like to thank the folks at NMEA, the entire team, particularly Nikki and Homi, for inviting me to speak here along with my colleague Adrian, but also providing us the opportunity to meet with a lot of you in the industry and get to understand the Taiwanese media and entertainment sector a little bit more in depth. So what we've been doing, my colleague and I, over the last 7 to 8 years, we've been tracking the media and entertainment space. But particularly today, we are looking at what's been happening in the world of traditional entertainment, i.e. cable TV and free-to-air. We look at online video, OTT, both subscription-based as well as advertising-based. And we'd like to share with you some of the insights and trends comparing Taiwan with the rest of Asia-Pacific. So if you look at the Taiwanese media and entertainment sector, you've got to remember that we are about 35 days away from ending this decade. In 35 days, we finish 10 years of this decade, and we start 2020, and it's the beginning of the new decade. And at that point, what we're seeing is roughly, if you take a look at it, the online video sector today has grown roughly about 4 times since 2015. It today accounts for roughly 20% of all entertainment spend, or all total video entertainment spend, or video revenue share. But by the end of 2024, we actually forecast that to reach roughly about 82%, right? So right now, sorry if I'm looking at right, it's roughly about 70-75%, not 80. My eyes are a little off. About 30%, roughly. It'll grow about 10% over the next 5.5 years or so. What that means is that this particular segment, online video, is expected to take share away from traditional television. And I know the panelists before spoke quite a bit in depth about what the impact of that could be, how to create IP, how to make sure that the industry produces IP that can also be protected, but more importantly, can be exported to make sure that the industry continues to grow. Particularly if you look at online video, just from a subscription perspective and a revenue perspective, online video today in Taiwan is just north of $400 million. And it's going to grow at roughly about 13% per annum between now and 2024, to an extent where it reaches just shy of $800 million. So from $400 million today, or about $410 million today at the end of 2019, to just shy of $800 million. That's a doubling of revenue, or 13% growth per annum. But the vast majority of that, if you notice the dark blue bar, is coming in from advertising, not from subscription. Subscription is growing. Yes, there's a lot of OTT platforms, and we'll talk more about it during the presentation. But a big chunk of that is still coming from an advertising industry. Now, if you look at advertising spend per media, and this is actually referring to incremental dollars. By incremental dollars, what we mean is, if you take 2019 as a base, for every new dollar that is spent on advertising, what proportion of that is going to television? What proportion of that is going to digital? And if you look at that chart, back in 2014, roughly 55-60% of that was going to television. Fast forward to 2019, just 30% of that is going to television. And of that digital advertising pie, if you look at that orange box right at the top, it's roughly about 20-ish% and growing. So much so that by the time we reach 2024, it'll be a full 20%. So it's about 12.5-13% now. It'll grow to 20% by the middle of the next decade. Now, if you look at fixed broadband, and this is really what's driving, this and mobile broadband is really what's driving all of that consumption here. I guess I don't need to tell you that. I mean, you've all got your phones up at this point in time, and you're going to be sharing all of that through networks like, through the mobile and the fixed broadband networks. But what's fascinating is that the fixed broadband penetration, and I believe one of the speakers alluded to this earlier today, is it's at one of the highest in this region. So Taiwan's fixed broadband penetration is by far one of the highest in the region. So you've got Singapore, you've got Taiwan, you've got Japan and Korea, which sort of lead when it comes to fixed broadband. But what is interesting and also fascinating for us as researchers and advertisers, or researchers and data crunchers, if you can call it that, is that while there is some growth in fixed broadband, it's starting to saturate, which means that telecom operators will need to look for other sources of revenue as they look to grow their businesses. And that's primarily going to come in from either video, online video, pay television, over the last 10 years, and now it's going to be focused on online video. Now, if you look at fixed broadband by technology, like I mentioned, the penetration or the growth in subscribers is starting to saturate. You're not seeing any new subscribers come on board. For most operators, that shift has largely been in moving away from copper-based networks to fiber. So much so that by the end of the decade or by the middle of the next decade, we actually believe that fiber will be by far the largest in terms of a technology. Cable will continue, but cable will be a smaller part. And even more so, we believe that the cable networks, I mean, we've got to take in a very conservative forecast. We believe that even some of the cable operators, as they look at what's called as greenfield networks or new build-outs, they will start to look at fiber as being a core sort of technology that they will consider. But the other thing that's popping up is actually 5G. And I believe there's a conversation that Daphne is going to be having on 5G later today, is we're starting to see the first rollouts of 5G across Asia Pacific. Now, in about 14 days from now, roughly, I think on the 10th of December, Taiwan will be conducting its 5G spectrum auctions, which is going to be crucial because there are two things that will come out of that. One is how much telcos pay for that spectrum, because the quantum that they spend on the spectrum will depend on how much money they have left to do other businesses. How much they spend into things like content, how much they spend into building up that service layer that powers the media and entertainment industry. You've seen the likes of China Mobile in China, you've seen Globe Telecom in the Philippines, you've got Optus and Telstra in Australia, who've all launched 5G networks. Some of them focused on mobile, and some of them focused on fixed wireless. Now, fixed wireless is where it's a replacement for a traditional fixed network, a cable TV network, or a cable network, or a fiber broadband network. And you're starting to see that in markets where you don't have fixed networks. Now, in Taiwan, it's an interesting situation that the country is in. You've got very highly penetrated fixed networks, but the question for us as analysts is going to be, by the end of the next decade, how much will 5G replace fixed networks? Will the two continue to overlap and coexist, or will you start to see one form of network slowly being replaced? It's early days. I guess it's too early to say how that's going to play out, but it's worth looking at it. Now, when it comes to mobile penetration, again, Taiwan sort of stands ahead of the curve. But there's one market when you look at 5G penetration in particular, and that stands out, and that's Korea. So if you look at the gray bar, you'll start to see, if you look right at the very top, Korea has already started to deploy 5G networks. It's gone commercial this year. Roughly, I think at the end of the last quarter, they had about 3.5 million 5G subscribers. But by the middle of the next decade, most of their subscribers would have moved to 5G networks. It's still early for the other markets. We think that developed Southeast Asia, primarily Singapore and Malaysia, will start to follow a similar pattern because they will move away from less efficient, more expensive technologies such as 3G and sort of skip and push it across to 5G. So we're going to start to see that evolution. Now, what this means for the entertainment industry is quite simple. Data consumption will go up. Speeds will increase significantly. And that means video consumption, video and gaming. How do IP owners, IP creators, folks like yourself who are sitting in the room today, leverage that technology? It isn't about the technology. You've got to remember that. 4G was about driving video. 4G was about driving entertainment and consumers. 5G is going to take that to the next level, but 5G is going to drive enterprises. And for creators, it will come in different ways. Would you leverage AR and VR? Would there be more use cases that we haven't thought about yet? We all talk about low latency, we talk about high speeds, but are there going to be new use cases for the content industry that we haven't thought about yet? And Taiwan, being at the center of technological evolution and innovation, will have to be playing a forefront role in that, in understanding and developing some of those technologies. Now, I spoke about data consumption. If you look at that green line, I think it sort of says a very good story, and I see Daphne smiling. Taiwan has, by far, in Asia, the highest per capita data consumption on mobile. I remember having these conversations with the mobile operators, and initially I thought I was misunderstanding something. Maybe there was a decimal place in there somewhere. Taiwan, or Taiwanese, all of you consume on average more data than every other market in Asia Pacific. Most of that is driven by video, so there's a lot of video consumption going on, good for IP owners. But the question is, as you move to 5G, and you'll see that little orange line going up, that's what's happened in Korea as a result of 5G deployments. It's grown 2.5 times over a period of 6 months. If that occurs in Taiwan, I think again the crucial question to be asked is, do the networks support it? Can the network support it? And if so, what are the returns for the telecommunications sector? One of the things that we often look at is how people spend money. So if you've got $10 in your pocket, maybe $10 is the wrong amount. Let's say you have $1,000 in your pocket. Are you going to be spending that on a Starbucks? Are you spending that on video services? Are you spending that on games, on pay television? Or are you spending that on mobile and fixed broadband services? So we compared Taiwan to all of the other markets in the region. Now, between 2019 and 2024, as we forecast where a new spend is, now again, this is based on incremental spend, not current spend. So for every new dollar between today and 2024 that a Taiwanese consumer spends, where is that new dollar going to go to? In Taiwan's case, less than 10% of that will go to pay television. So if you have $100 in your pocket, you're going to be spending less than 10 NT on pay television. You will be spending roughly 15% of that on D2C SWOT. So services like Netflix, like Friday, Hami, iQIYI, things of that sort. A big chunk of that, close to 65%, will go towards mobile broadband. You love your devices. Everyone's got one in their hand right now. And then another 10 to 15%, 10%, if you were to be gracious, would go towards fixed broadband. So there's a clear shift in how consumers are deciding what to spend, where to spend. Now the question, again, these are forecasts, so you've got to remember that. The question is, does that gray bar, which constitutes only 10% for OTT services, incremental spend, shift? Because if you look at markets like Singapore, for example, or Australia and New Zealand, that shift is significant. Consumers have been paying for video services. It's been less pronounced here in Taiwan, as we saw in earlier slides. Now, a quick comparison between Taiwan in terms of the revenue, actual revenue, that's coming into the video industry, compared to say markets like Australia, New Zealand, or Japan, or even Korea. What's fascinating is that the Taiwanese media sector, or the video sector in particular, will see some growth, about $1 billion, give or take, over the next 5 to 7 years or so. But interestingly, most of that is going to go to pay television. Pay television will continue to play a dominant role here in Taiwan. OTT will grow, and all of that growth, that $1 billion growth that we see, will be attributed to that sector. But pay television, traditional TV, cannot be written off yet. It still plays a role, it still drives content consumption, it still drives content investment. And therefore, both new media and pay television, traditional television, will need to find a way to coexist and play a crucial role in understanding where IP comes in, on how IP investment takes place. One cannot be ignored at the expense of the other. If you look at markets like Japan, and if you look at a market like, for example, Australia and New Zealand, though, that shift is a lot more pronounced, if you can call it that. The shift to OTT has been felt for the last 3 to 4 years in a market like Australia. Consumers are moving en masse to OTT services. They've been cutting the cord for pay television, and even more so when it comes to sports content shifting onto OTT. So a lot of consumers have shifted away to not just entertainment services on OTT, but also to sports services. And that's really affecting the traditional sector. So you'll see that pay television, the gray bar, has reduced quite a bit. And free-to-air, which has always been a strong sector, has also started to reduce. And it's the same case if you look at Japan. In Japan, too, that shift has been seismic. OTT services are growing quite significantly. Pay television is fairly stable at the moment, but most of that loss that OTT is gaining from is coming from free-to-air television. So again, going back to my earlier point, traditional television sector will need to figure out a way to coexist and to manage this disruption. Either they disrupt themselves or they get disrupted, and we're seeing clear examples of that. When we look at advertising spend, and I mentioned, of the roughly $400 million that's coming in into the video sector here, much of that, or the OTT sector particularly, most of that is from advertising. And if you look at the new dollars that's coming in Taiwan's case, we expect to see more than 50% of new advertising spend to be shifted to digital. It's not going to pay television. It's not going to free to air. That money is all going to be spent on online. And if you check out YouTube and Facebook, or the international platforms, Taiwan will generate roughly about $150 million in advertising revenue. So of that remaining money that we saw, most of that will go to a YouTube or a Google and a Facebook. And therefore, posing this question back to the sector, back to the industry, back to the people in the room, how do local IP owners, local publishers, local content creators, and platforms try and bring some of this revenue back in-house? Just before I quickly wrap up, I just wanted to give you a quick idea of how we're seeing trends in other markets between pay TV versus online video subscribers and the revenue. So there's a clear delta between the two. For those of you who have a pay television or a cable TV subscription at home and an OTT service, you're probably spending anywhere between $250 and $600 NT dollars a month on your pay television service or your cable TV service. But when it comes to OTT, you're probably spending a fraction of that. In a market like Australia, what's happened is today the number of OTT subscribers is significantly higher than pay television. And it's happened in a very quick period of time. Consumers there have voted with their wallets. But when you look at the revenue, it's starting to catch up. What used to be a 26 times delta between what consumers spend on OTT versus pay TV, today is only a 2 times delta. And most likely by the end of next year, OTT or online video will be bigger than traditional pay television in Australia. If you look at Singapore, it's a market where I live right now, we're seeing this disruption quite a bit. To an extent where today the delta between pay TV subscribers and OTT subscribers is very minimal. We expect that in 2020, there will be more OTT subscribers in Singapore than there will be pay TV. However, if you look at the delta between what they pay, the ARPU in Singapore on pay television is significantly higher than OTT today. So OTT customers, and if you look at your own individual spend, on average, you'll be subscribing to and paying for not more than 2.5 or 3 services. Sometimes you'll be sharing services with friends and family. You don't need to admit who they are. We all share services, and we all share subscriptions and password. It's a big issue that the industry is facing. With cable TV, there was piracy, yes, but the quantum of piracy was significantly lower than what we're seeing in online video. And therefore, the OTT platforms will need to think about that, because your profitability will be linked to how many new subscribers you can get. And I believe it was Joanne who mentioned it earlier today in her session that it's a long gestation period for OTT. It isn't a 1 to 2 year profitability period. You're looking at 6 to 8 years because of technology investments, because of content investments, because of marketing costs. Subscriber acquisition cost for online video is significant. And subscriber churn on OTT versus pay TV is very different. Subscribers tend to churn away from online video much quicker than a pay television service. Finally, going and taking a look at Taiwan, we believe that while D2C subscribers have been growing, there's still a fairly decent delta between pay television and OTT. We believe it's going to take at least another 4 to 5 years before that delta is crossed. But when it comes to revenue, while the gap has closed, there's still much more that needs to be done. We believe what we saw here in Australia could be replicated in Taiwan. But what's one of the biggest advantages in a market like Taiwan is that ARPU for pay television is actually much lower. Pay TV penetration in Taiwan is much higher. And therefore, the time taken to actually get those 2 lines to cross, we believe will take at least 5 to 7 years. Now, just before I wrap up, this one final slide. And this is something my colleague and I, we often take a look at this slide or different iterations of this. Taiwan today has more OTT services than any other market in Asia Pacific. At last count, I think when we looked at it, we counted official services roughly about 23 or 25. That's almost, a million, based on the population. I think there's enough and more OTT services to go around. Let's put it that way. But beyond the joke, beyond all that bad humor, our concern is this. And I think, again, the panelists in the previous session referred to this or alluded to this. One is, how many platforms is too many platforms? Can each and every one of these services become profitable? If not, what is the future? And this is important because consumers, like I said, will not pay for more than 2 or 3 services. There is significant technology investment required. There is significant IP required, investment in content, people. Perhaps when we do the summit next year, some of these icons may not remain on this board. But it is something that the industry needs to consider. What is the path to profitability? What is the path to consolidation? And where does organizations like the NMEA, like the Ministry of Culture, what role do they play in making sure that not only does the industry benefit, but consumers benefit as well? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Aravind Venugopal, for your sharing.